thanks to the organizer for giving me this opportunity. This is my first time in IMSC, and it's actually a really nice campus, and I hope to come here more often. So I'm a new faculty in the Department of Applied Mechanics and Biomedical Engineering, and it's essentially an engineering department. So we have a new lab. It's called the Interface Lab, and sort of the broad agenda is to use ideas from physics and biology and use it in problems in mechanics and robotics, so that you can use them in productive ways. So the talk that I'm going to talk about today is part my postdoc work, and then something that I've been doing for a while, and it's been in the back burner since the semester started. It's called Behavioral Priors for Control of Collectives. It's little grandiose in its mission, but at least I'll try to convince you that there is some progress that we can make if you take biology as inspiration. So the broad outline of the talk is we're going to talk about this notion of sociality, which is essentially there in animal kingdom, and then we're going to use social insects as our model system and be inspired by them to create artificial agents or robots that can perform some collective task. And I'm going to talk about some new work that I've been working on navigation, again inspired by social insects, and some room for progress in theories, which I think I would require a lot of input from people here on adaptation, and I'll just leave with some conclusions. Okay, so the big picture is that the animal kingdom is stratified into so many different ways, and one of the ways where you can actually ramify them is this notion of sociality, where animals are either solitary, social, or eusocial. So solitary animals are ones which are basically by themselves for the most part, except for courtship and mating. Some of the examples include snow leopard, polar bear, turtles. And the second way by which you can classify them is the social group, which is the biggest group. You have crustaceans, you have scorpions, moths, beetles, spiders. They are all social. They are not really living by themselves. They share space with others of the same species, and they interact with each other primarily to share resource. And the top, and there's of course further stratifications that are possible, which I'm not going to discuss here. And the higher up in the hierarchy is the eusocial set of animals or insects for the most part, where these groups, this set of species can actually perform cooperative tasks. They can take care of themselves. They have cooperative brood care. And strangely enough, most of the colony of these insects are sterile. They cannot reproduce, and they essentially have reproductive or dominant hierarchy. There's usually one or few reproducing queens for the most part, and they have overlapping generations. So they are all sisters by genetics, and they actually take care of themselves. And they can perform a whole lot of tasks together, and the most common examples are termites, ants, bees, and wasps. So I'm just trying to motivate why social insects are interesting, both from a biological standpoint and a physical standpoint. The first point is that these insects can actually perform a variety of tasks. Some of them are, they can forage together, they can perform tasks like nest maintenance, they can perform brood care as I mentioned, they can do construction and repair, and they can also defend themselves against various kinds of predators. Why is this interesting from a physical standpoint? The reason it's interesting is because these agents are all completely autonomous. There is no central control. So essentially these are independent agents making real-time decisions, and all the tasks that they are performing are performed without a map, which is to say any task that I highlighted earlier is performed by these agents just in real time without them actually knowing what is the bigger picture of their actions. So in that sense, the task itself is emergent. So if you take a single ant, for example, and then just track its behavior, you wouldn't be able to predict what the macroscopic task that they're performing is, and which is fundamentally very similar to sort of the emergent phenomena that we are used to in physics. And the other interesting aspect is these agents are all adaptable in the sense you tune or change the conditions of the environment. The task itself seems to be robust to perturbations in the environment, in the sense that they're able to actually modulate their motor actions such that the task is still successful. So then the question really is going back to, can one learn from these social insects to design better artificial systems? So that's sort of the broad goal for now, and we're going to take ants as our specific model organism and try to see if we can build systems inspired by these ants. So just a couple of minutes on ant morphology and physiology. So ants essentially have, so their afferent system, or essentially the sensory modalities, are pretty complex. I'm going to stick to very shallow description here. So they have, their body can be divided into head, mesosoma and gaster. So they have eyes with which obviously they see, and they can also see well into the UV spectrum. And they have mandibles with which they can modify their environment, manipulate their environment. And they have antennae with which they interact with each other, and they can also sense pheromones. And they have legs with which they move. And the gaster part is where the pheromone organs are located, and that's what they use to lay the pheromones. And there is this thing called the ocelli, which is actually not completely well understood, but it's supposed to detect light intensity. So that's sort of the broad physiology, and with which they actually have a set of, so this is sort of the physiology, and they actually use this physiology in order to perform specific set of motor actions, which are called behaviors. And here is one very famous one, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It's essentially trail following behavior. So here is the trail of pheromone, which an ant is able to track quite well. And this study, this paper that came out a few years back, was looking at how they, what's the strategy of antennation they use in order to ensure that they don't go out of track. So essentially they use their antennae to follow pheromones, and they do it really, really well. And they also have sensory organs in their mandibles that can detect forces acting on the objects that they are carrying. So even though in this example you might have seen there is a leader who actually helps this collective to drive this entire food towards a particular direction, and they are not communicating via some external means, but they are using the object itself to transmit information. So there's again some sensory feedback coming from the mandibles. And the last thing that I want to show is they also use tactile feedback, essentially by touching each other in order to determine what to do next. So here is a set of collective of ant, and here is the sort of the contact map, if you will. So all these points are where all ants have actually made contact with each other, and you see that this contact network is pretty dense. That's just tracking. They're just tracking the, you see the body axis angle that's been plotted. It's essentially just the orientation of this line. And it's all imaged in the dark. So there's also a cruel process by which they've extracted the pheromone and they've laid it out, and then these guys are walking on this trail, and it's imaged in the dark. Yeah. Okay, so the broad understanding as it stands today is that of embodiment, which is that an agent's behavior is determined by firstly other agents, other ants, and it's via their communication through antennation or pheromone, and it's also modulated through the environment. So you have the dynamics of the agent, their interaction, and then the environment in which they live, which determines what they actually do. So with this sort of broad outline, can we go and basically design artificial systems that can perform some of these tasks that these agents can, these ants can do. And the specific task that I'll be describing today is that of construction, and I'll just briefly show some earlier results on deconstruction that again I did during my postdoc. So we are going to use for this bottom-up approach, just like I've described today. We are going to build these agents which have similar morphological capacity to that of an ant. So this is the sort of the custom robot that we built in our lab. They have essentially haptotactic and phototactic feedback, which is to say they can sense if there is something in the front or not through these bump sensors. And they also have phototactic feedback. They can detect light. They have 2 light sensors at the bottom with which they can detect if any light is projected at the bottom or not. So that's, I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind because that's going to be useful for what we look at next. And it has a microcontroller, sort of the brain, and it has a servo motor with which it can pick and drop objects, trying to mimic mandibles, and it's powered by motors that power wheels, so these are wheeled robots. Yeah, so the capacity of this agent is sort of similar to that of an ant. So it can manipulate the environment via these servos with which they pick and drop objects, and they can sense if someone is in the front or not, and they can also sense light field at the bottom. So this is approximately 5 by 5 by 5 centimeter cube. It's, yeah, this is all the components are, off the shelf, and we were trying to do everything in house, but this is essentially put together in the lab. Yeah, I mean, after this is the 5th generation. And then the setup itself is as follows. I'll just describe briefly how this idea of mimicking pheromones works. So this is the experimental setup where we have a table and we have a projector at the bottom, and there is a camera at the top that tracks where each robot is on the table. And then this projector will essentially project light onto some translucent sheet, and by tracking the location of each robot, we know where it is, and then you can essentially project a light field that mimics pheromones. So is that clear? So the idea is you track the location of the robot, and then you can project a light field along the trajectory that each robot actually travels. That's the only reason why reason we actually build something outside of just the agents. You can imagine this is a setup that just mimics pheromones, where this robot is able to just lay light feed. Okay, so that's, and we call this photomone because it's generating sort of photons through this projector. Is this clear? So, and then the environment itself is just set of PVC pipes with magnetic rings, so that these robots can just pick and place those PVC pipes. Okay, and so we essentially have also the components required for this embodiment, which is the agents. They're communicating with each other via this photomone field that they're going to generate, and the environment is essentially here the substrate. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to use the bottom-up approach. So let me briefly describe what the dynamics of a single agent is. So the dynamics is given by this. So each rant can, so we call it rant, robotic ant. We were just too dull. Yeah, it's a dull sounding name, less creative. Yeah, so the position is going to evolve as V naught times p hat, where p hat is the orientation vector, and the orientation dynamics is given by some rotation velocity, and then the rotation velocity is proportional to the gradient in the field that it detects. This reduces to chemotaxis framework if you just assume small angular deformations, and this is essentially the dynamics. And let's see what happens to this dynamics when you assume that there is a background field of light which is having a constant gradient. So the gradient is just decaying as a function of distance from a given center, and in that limit you can actually write this dynamics into this set of phase which is given by the angle made by this orientation with respect to the global reference frame, and then the distance from the center itself. So essentially this dynamic reduces to this, and you can immediately see that there are two fixed points in this dynamics, which is given by these two values, where psi star is pi by 2 and r star is v0 by g lambda. Just a quick reminder, g is essentially the gain, which is telling you how much I turn when I detect a gradient field, right? So that's the proportionality constant, or you can imagine this as the chemotaxis strength. So this is the fixed point that we get, and you can see that this fixed point corresponds to a circular trajectory. So this guy is just going to keep revolving around this constant gradient field at a particular distance away from the center. And we did these experiments, I'm just showing you a sample. This is from the robots that we built, and you can see that it follows nicely this result that we found. This is just G is something we can control, yeah. So next we went on to see what's the dynamics when these agents can generate this photomon field, which is given by this simple rate equation type equation, but just that it's now spatially dependent field. So this is the evolution of the light field itself, where it's being generated by the agents based on where they are, and there's a constant decay rate to this intensity field. This is just the density field, and it can generate this field with a given width W. So what we again found was, there's a obviously when you do these experiments you have to account for all kinds of finite size effects. So we found that actually the distance between the sensors start playing a role, and you can find essentially a similar trapped phase for these agents, and that's determined by the width of the ratio of the width of the light field that's being generated and the distance between the center and the gain. So there's a critical gain for a given width of light field that's being generated at which these agents are going to be trapped. And again, you can do this in simulations, and then this one. This is just generation of. Yeah, so if you imagine we are trying to emulate pheromones, so pheromones are going to just decay after a while. I mean, essentially they are volatile, they can diffuse, and they can also, we actually assume both diffusion and decay, but I'm just showing you this with decay. So there's a length scale associated with the speed and the rate of decay, which is sort of, I think this might be there in the schematic, yeah, which is basically this length scale. That L minus is telling you the length scale over which a given concentration field is going to survive given there's V0 velocity. Yeah, so this is the trap, we found that these guys are going to get trapped, and we can calculate this phase boundary both for single agent and also for several of them together. And so from here on, our ultimate goal was, okay, so now we have this dynamics, how do we make these guys essentially perform this task of construction? And what we had to do was cook up a list of behavioral rules associated with when to pick up and when to drop. I've just listed them down here, but the way we came up with had some biological inspiration, which I'm not going to talk about today. But the rules that we came up with are to follow gradients, just like what we've seen in the passive dynamics, and pick up objects when the intensity of light field is small, and drop them when it crosses a critical threshold. And on the way back, just avoid anything, just avoid obstacles and other robots. So these bump sensors actually cannot distinguish between other agents and the boundary element itself. So it's sort of agnostic to that. So even with this very simplistic set of rules, actually we got something very interesting. And this is what we got. So let me just play the video and then explain. So what happens is, this is the full experimental setup. So you have these PVC pipes, and we've just marked them so that we can track these guys using the camera recording. And you'll see hands of mine and Fabio, another postdoc in the group. We did this together. And so what we see is that they actually use this trapping instability to create the nucleation site, and then use this nucleation site as a way to actually start putting in these elements at that given location. So you see hands because we didn't have enough elements and our domain was small. So, and as every time they visit that site, they spend more time and that light field gets reinforced, and this process just continues. So essentially the trapping instability is used to create this nucleation site, which can then be used as a site for construction. And this came about, like, in speaking to the broader goal of using behavioral priors for a specific function seems to work here in this case. And then now you can tune parameters in the experimental setup and then essentially get some heuristics. So here is the area of the cluster as a function of the cooperation parameter, which is how justly they follow the pheromone trail. We see that with increase in cooperation, and this is averaged across several trials, is that the cluster size increases and then they are also more compact. So the perimeter of the cluster itself goes down with increase in cooperation. And we also found, as I mentioned, there is this threshold beyond which these guys start this construction itself. We went and checked how robust is this essentially strategy by closing down the, cancelling the threshold and also playing with the cooperation parameter. What we found was both of them are really important if you want to get successful construction. So you have to be really good at following pheromone trails, and there is some collective threshold that each one has if you want to get a successful construction. And this actually also generalizes to this task of deconstruction. I'll just show the video here and then I'll leave it. I can discuss more about this if there's interest after the talk. So essentially the same setup, we showed that agents can perform construction and escape or deconstruction without again a map of the task. And what you'll see is that these guys are, this is the background light field that it's self-generated, and they use that to start escape, and they all leave the boundary. So again, you can calculate how well is the escape based on the time it takes to escape, and also the variance of the tunnel that they may make. And it seems to, obviously with cooperation, this efficacy is improved, and that's just an observation. So with that, that's essentially part of my postdoc work, and then navigation is something that I'm working on right now. Yeah, I think I'll spend the next 15 minutes talking about that. So navigation, just like construction, is really a fundamental task that each colony has to do so that they can go and forage for food. So navigation itself has a variety of strategies, and there's a hierarchy in the animal kingdom. The simplest one is what is known as locomotor guidance, which is essentially just following trails laid out by someone else, and it's also egocentric. So egocentric locomotor guidance strategies are primitive, and they are much more simpler to implement, and you don't need a complex neural background to essentially implement this strategy. And the second strategy, or slightly complex strategy, is what is known as path integration, which I'll describe briefly. And for you to actually be able to do path integration, you also need a physiological basis. I'll briefly describe that as well. And then the third complex strategy is essentially landmark based navigation, where you're able to place yourself in the context of your environment. So you move from egocentric, where you just have a representation with respect to yourself, to a representation set in an environment. So that's the allocentric framework, where you now have an understanding of the environment and you place yourself based on that, and that's the landmark based navigation. And the most complex that humans and I think mice and other complex animals use is what is known as map based navigation or route based navigation, and that's the ultimate sort of way by which we navigate, because we have an entire representation of the map in our mind or brain. So we are going to stick to path integration and locomotor guidance because that's what ants use, and the path integration idea itself has a pretty fascinating story going back to the early 1900s. So there is a very special species of ant called the Saharan desert ant, Cataglyphis, which exists and which does foraging in the desert where the temperatures can go up to 70 degrees Celsius. So at 70 degree, pheromones being volatile will just vanish really fast, so they have to actually come up with a different strategy to ensure that they can convey this information to other agents, and also to be able to go back to the nest so that they are not lost, because you cannot use landmarks. In desert, there's everything is the same everywhere, it's isotropic. So what they found was, this is an experimental trial, and the initial observations were made by this Swiss and Italian, essentially engineer and a librarian who were posted in Africa, and they found these ants roaming around, and they made some interesting observations about them. So this is the trajectory of one Cataglyphis, where you start with its location in the nest, and then they go on this outbound trajectory along this trail, and then they find the food source, and then what they found was these guys essentially just walk back to the nest. So this is the outbound trajectory and this is the inbound trajectory, and along one direction it seems to take a much more roundabout path, and on the way back it seems to have a much straighter path. So this was really perplexing because the size of an ant is like 7 mm or let's say 1 centimeter, whereas the size of this trail is 1.5 kilometers. And this guy is able to do this, and this led to several sets of experiments, and Wiener in the early 2000s came up with a very, very nice set of experiments to understand how they do it. So what Wiener did was, in this really nice paper, I think he's written a series of really, really nice papers where he hypothesizes that the ant needs to have two things. One is a pedometer or step counter, odometer, and also a way to measure angular velocity or angle differences. With those two essentially sensory modalities, they can actually integrate that to keep track of what is known as the homing vector. So they keep integrating the past, distance, and the orientation along a particular direction so that they can keep track of where their home is. And this was before, actually this was, the earlier experiments were before they understood that ants also use polarization in the sky. But essentially it's a combination of this internal step counter, angular velocity measuring modality, which is through this thing called optic flow, and then a global reference that's there in the sky. So it uses these three different information to keep track of the homing vector. So the question that I'm interested in is to see, so I should mention that after they did these experiments with ants, it's sort of now assumed that all ants have at least a primitive version of these ability to keep track of their home, and also to use the global reference, which is the polarization in the sky, to keep track of home. So then with that context, so the question that I'm right now interested in is, how would ants be able to navigate in environments where you already have a pheromone trail? So let's say you already have a pheromone trail, and that pheromone trail is leading you to food source, but now let's say that food source is not sufficient to meet the demands of the nest. At what point along this trail would you have to innovate so that you can meet the demands of the nest? So the approach that I'm going to use to solve this problem is that of reinforcement learning. I'll just describe this real quick. This reinforcement learning essentially is a technique where each agent is described by its state and actions. So agent is, let's say, at a given state, it can perform a particular action and move to a new state, and for performing that action it gets a reward R1, and then it keeps doing this let's say till the time step goes from 0 to t. So there are two things that you have to know to sort of understand how reinforcement learning works. One is known as the policy, which is essentially a probability distribution of taking a particular action given that you are at a given state S. And the second thing is the value function, which is an estimate of how much reward you're going to get given that, let's say, you are at state S1. So value function is telling you what is the integral of the reward. Let's say I start from S1 till ST. It's going to sum up all the rewards that I get in all these steps, and there is gamma, just a discount factor depending on how much you are willing to bet on the future. And you can write this value function by expanding this estimation, and this is known as the Bellman equation. And the way you actually solve this Bellman equation is there's like a whole host of techniques to solve this optimization problem. The way you do this is, the simplest way you do this is using this technique called temporal difference learning, where you just take one step and then update your value function based on how much reward you got in that step, given that you're following some random policy, and then you keep updating the policy and also the value function. And there's an error associated with it, which is known as the temporal difference error, and you can keep doing this so that you minimize this temporal difference error and you reach what is known as the optimal value function, at which you have a set of actions that you have to take so that you can perform this task in the best possible manner. So that's broadly the technique of reinforcement learning, and this temporal difference learning itself has some recent research in neuroscience, and where they found that we are also probably using something like a temporal difference learning to learn our tasks on a day-to-day basis. And there is some connection to stochastic optimal control, which I think I'm going to skip. And this is the exact problem that looking at. So let's say you have a given trail which is in this semicircular manner, and you have your home or the nest which is at B and the food source is at A. And you have already traversed this trail, and you have some vague idea of where the food source is, and now you're not able to meet the demands at B, and you have to start innovating from the semicircular trail so that you can reach this food source in a fast manner. An important thing to note is that your state space and then the action space is actually right now continuous. So your state is given by the position, and the action is essentially the orientation. Both of them are continuous, and it's often very difficult to perform these optimizations on continuous domains, which is where the behavioral priors can help, and it actually reduces the complexity by a lot. So the way we do this is essentially split this problem into two parts, where you're able to follow the trail up to a given location, and then after a point you start doing this exploration, and you assume a policy or essentially a process by which you perform this exploration, and you have also a reward that is a function of where you leave the trail. So if you start leaving the trail much earlier than, let's say, the food source, there's going to be larger error, and that's captured through this OU policy, which I'll show in the next slide. The diffusion is going to be much larger for, let's say, breaking off at this location than at some other location. But of course, if you break off here and hit this location, then the reward is also going to be larger. So there is essentially something like a speed accuracy trade-off, but now in the spatial domain. And it has this problem itself has some connection which people have studied in minimum variance in motor tasks and things like that. So this is how the dynamics, passive dynamics without learning happens. It's just an agent just following this semicircular trail, and then it breaks off and it accumulates some reward along its trail. And if you do learning on this, this is how it works. So these are several trajectories of this agent, and then this is the reward that it gets, and using TD learning you can see that you can parameterize this entire value function just along this arc length or just the angle, they're both the same, and you see that you arrive at a policy. Once you have actually found out the value function, optimal value function, your policy is just going to be just pick the angle with maximum value, and you're just going to walk along that direction, and because that's where the probability of hitting the target is maximum, or the variance is going to be minimum. Yeah, so you have, this is the dynamics of the learning itself, and with some very simple calculation you can actually capture this non-monotonic behavior, which is that, you know, the intrinsic policies just can be mapped to a warm leg chain model, for which you can exactly evaluate the value function. So I'll be done in 1 minute. And then for the Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process in the orientation, it's in the small angle limit, this is just going to, the variance can be exactly evaluated, and you can also calculate the value function exactly, and you can calculate the total reward. So you can put these together, and then this is just some result showing that this is the value function that the agent learns, and this is the prediction from this essentially the model, and they both match well, which is to show that, or the larger point of doing this is that the agent's capacity to keep track of where the final food source is actually limited by how well they remember the food source itself. So let me say this again. So an individual's capacity to find the best solution is sort of limited by how well they remember their previous trajectories. And if you imagine a collective setting, you can see that you're always going to reach some suboptimal solution, because the shortest path is essentially the straight line, and which if you choose an agent arbitrarily, their capacity is going to be limited such that they can never find their optimal solution. So which means that diversity is sort of important if you want to find better solutions, and that's something that you can infer just by looking at the single agent dynamics. And the thing that I'm right now working on is essentially extending this to many agents. And the really interesting thing, so the usual approach is what is known as central controller approach, which is not something that we are interested in. The ultimate solution that we propose is essentially using pheromone as the reward information itself, which might be something that the agents are using. So if you imagine there are two trajectories, one shorter than the other, and we know that ants actually leave pheromone trails on the way back. So like here, you'll see it finds the food source and it's not able to carry the food source back. So what it will do is, I'll let the ant do its thing. So it tries to pull the food, and you see the motion is very choppy because it's actually laying the pheromones. And you would also you might also want to remember that the outbound trajectory was different from the inbound. And then with this pheromone, which is encoding the reward, actually it has managed to convey this information about the food source in one go, and which is why it's called one-shot learning. And that's one way by which collectives can learn these tasks, and which is what I'm trying to implement in this problem. And there are, I think, a lot of interesting statistical physics questions associated with this. I'll just leave them here, and I'm happy to talk about it over tea. And yeah, I'll just leave this slide, conclusion slide, which says that it's really important to account for this changes in the environment and use the embodiment framework. And our approach is really going to be analysis, hypothesis, and somehow synthesis this in the robotic platform.
Okay, yeah, thank you for a very nice talk.
You had this value function which had a maximum, right? So it essentially tells you that there is a optimal distance from where it has to depart, right?
Correct.
But you don't see this in the multiple agents, right?
Because yes, so it's different in the sense that it's not the exact same problem, but I was just trying to say that you can implement this kind of learning in collective. So the way traditional people do it in collectives is you have one, let's say, neural network which is just learning the task. All the agents are essentially just training the same network, which really defeats the purpose of having collectives, right? Because they have their own individual capacity to make decisions. Instead, they use the central network that just takes decisions on everyone's behalf. But one way by which it seems like these ants might be performing this adaptational learning is by storing this value function itself in the environment, which is through pheromones. let's say I have one pheromone trail which is weaker than another one, it's more likely that the stronger one has more reward. Like it's probably the shortest route compared to the weaker one. That's what I was trying to.
Very nice. So my question is something, so you have this small number of robots doing something. How is it an improvement over computer simulation?
Yeah, so
Because
we also did this.
you're actually simulating a model in some sense.
Yeah, we're simulating a model. The really tricky thing, there is this thing called the simulation to reality gap in robotics, where you're not able to account for all the contact forces or the nonlinearities associated with friction, because if you want to capture all the details about the geometry and they're all heterogeneous, they're not identical. So if you want to bring all of that in, you really have to, and if you want to assume that they're sort of subleading order effects, then yeah, that is, you mean in terms of in experiments? Yeah, these are not, yeah, if you design them properly, I think they're scalable. But yeah, I think you need some speciality which I don't have to do them at much bigger scale.